We're so happy that you're here tonight. I don't know if this is your first time on our campus, the first time maybe that you've been acquainted with Southern Evangelical Seminary. There are a number of people around associated with the seminary in a number of different ways. If you're interested in finding more about what we have to offer as far as bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, D-Min and PhD, then by all means grab somebody that might look official and ask them about our school, because we would love to tell you about that. Now, not too long ago, I was at a conference. It was actually ETS, Evangelical Theological Society, if you're not familiar with that. It's an annual meeting of evangelical theologians and philosophers who come together for peer review and camaraderie and encouragement and fellowship and things like that. It's in different places around the country each year. So what happens when you go to an ETS, pretty much, everybody's flying in from wherever they hail, and they're all getting at the airport at roughly the same time of the day. So invariably, you meet others at the baggage, carousel who are, going to ETS, and you get into these conversations. So, and then invariably, you get on the shuttle van that takes you to the resort hotel, and you get into this sort of, cliche conversation with people you don't know. So this was happening. We're all sitting around, and there was a friend of mine there that I knew. We didn't. He's not at SES, but I knew him from other venues, and so they were all, where are you at? Well, I'm at this university. I'm at this seminary. Finally, that rang a bell with one of the guys that asked my friend. He said, "Oh, I know so and so at your place. Do you know them?" And he goes, "No, philosophy department." He said, I'm in this other department, and then he goes, because those philosophers, they just sit around and talk about stuff that's just not very important. That's what he said. Now, I thought he was just jerking my chain because he was a friend of mine. So I thought, okay, that's a little salvo that he's launched my way, so I'm going to take the cue and launch one right back. And I said, yeah, philosophers, we talk about unimportant things like God and truth. Who cares about that kind of stuff? Okay, now, this is an unwritten law, but I think there is a sort of protocol when you start jerking each other's chains. You only kind of do it once. And then you laugh and then you move on. No, he comes back with a retort. No, they sit around and talk about whether red exists. Okay? First of all, I don't know what he's got against red. But be that as it may, that's a different issue. But okay, now I didn't have the presence of mind, probably wouldn't have had the courage if I had thought about it at the time. But afterwards, I'm rehearsing this story in my mind. And I thought, what I should have said was, if you don't understand why that's an important question for a Christian, vis-a-vis how you understand the existence and nature of God, then, you need some philosophical schooling. That's what I would have said or something like that. And then he probably would have beat me up after that. I think that's you jerk chains twice and then it comes to fisticuffs here. So, likely you already understand why, does red exist? You probably already understand why that's an important question, or at least you're interested enough in it to know, why do people care about these kinds of things? And I've already hinted at least at one thing, that it's tethered very closely to how one understands what God is like as creator. As a Christian, you would understand God as creator, and how those two relate to one another as far as existence or non-existence of abstract objects or universals or things of this nature. So that's what we're going to explore tonight. We're being streamed. Are we being streamed? Okay, I think this is like the first time I've ever been streamed, so let me just savor. What I should do, you have to work this out in advance. I didn't get prior permission to do this, but what I should have done, so you guys would know not to laugh when I did it, but I should have just been talking and go, so we're really glad that everybody came. And people are going, they're pushing all the buttons, They think they're streaming. That stuff never works. But we're happy to explore this question tonight. So maybe you're interested in why people are interested in this question. This is what we're going to do. So let me introduce the speakers that we have. I may use a sort of a philosophical kind of lingo. Right here is Peter van Inwagen, professor at Notre Dame University. I actually have some bios that I'm just not going to read to you. But we're so excited for you to be here tonight. We thank you so much for for carving us in. He spends some of his time in North Carolina teaching at Duke, so he goes back and forth. I don't know how often you have to do that, but Dr. William Lane Craig at Biola sometimes during the year, probably spending most of your time traveling and speaking, and well known among the seminary family here, a hero to many of us associated with SES, probably all of us to some extent. And then Dr. J.T. Bridges, who is a professor of philosophy here at Southern Evangelical Seminary and also directs the PhD program here. So what we're going to do is Dr. Inwagen is going to go first. He'll have about a 20-minute opening and get his position out onto the table. Then Dr. Craig will go next, relatively uninterrupted, just go right after. And then Dr. Bridges will go third. And then after that, that'll take an hour. And then we'll probably take just a few minutes for stretch your legs and that kind of thing. And then we'll go into some questions and sort of interaction. And what I'd like to do is maybe start it off when we get to that stage by inviting each of them to query the others in a relatively informal kind of way. But we want to make sure we'll save enough time towards the end that we want your interaction. So we'll have a microphone. Rumor has it. Right now we have a stand, so we're all excited about that part. We're on the way, but hopefully there will be a mic up here eventually, and then you will be invited at a proper time to come up and pose your questions. Now, what I would encourage you to do, if you think of a question during someone's presentation, write it down if you have anything to write on, because likely you're going to forget that question when you hear the rest of the discussion. So write it down so that you can remember that. All right? So, without any further ado, and someday I would love to be in an event where the guy speaking has all the further ado. Wouldn't that be great? You ever wondered who, it's like, everybody I've ever heard speak, they never have any further ado. So without any further ado, one day he was like, the guy that had all the further ado that we were all wondering where in the world it was, here he is finally. But anyway, without any further ado, Professor Van Inwagen, he was great. Thank you, sir, very much.
Well, it is certainly a great honor to have been asked to participate in this debate, if that's what it is, and I'm very appreciative of it. I'm going to discuss abstract objects, and in particular, I'm going to discuss shapes. I choose shapes because, if for no other reason, they're rarely mentioned in ontological debates, and people may therefore have fewer preconceptions about shapes than they have about, say, attributes or numbers or propositions. And I will use phrases like the ball and the cube and so on to name shapes. I do not mean to suggest by this choice or this terminology that shapes constitute a sui generis ontological category. It may be, for example, that the shape that I call the cube is nothing other than the property of being cubical. And moreover, if phrases like the ball and the cube sound in any way suspicious to you, feel free to replace them with phrases like the shape a thing has if and only if it's spherical, or the shape a thing has in virtue of being cubical. Now, I will first defend the thesis that there are, or at any rate could be, shapes that nothing has. Consider the 5 Platonic solids, that is, regular, convex polyhedra, all of whose faces are of the same size and shape, and all of whose edges are the same length. Among them is the cube, a regular, convex polyhedron with 6 faces, each of them a square. A less familiar Platonic solid is the icosahedron, a regular convex polygon which has 20 faces, each an equilateral triangle. There are exactly 5 Platonic solids, which was proved by Euclid, if by no earlier mathematician. Now, it's not easy to make an icosahedral artifact, a thing, roughly shaped like a ball, except it's got 20 faces, each of which is an equilateral triangle. And there obviously was a time when none of them had yet been made. For all I know, none had yet been made when Euclid first published his Elements. Let's suppose so. Now, it happens that there are naturally occurring icosahedral objects, certain viruses, for example. but none that an ancient Greek could have known of. So let's suppose we're in Alexandria in 270 BC, and we hear a critic say to Euclid, Euclid, you're wrong. You say there are 5 Platonic solids, among them the icosahedron. But nothing is icosahedral, and the icosahedron is a shape. And it's absurd to suppose that there's a shape and that there's nothing of that shape, a shape that nothing has. Therefore, there are at most 4 Platonic solids. Well, let's suppose we agree with the critic that there can't be a shape that nothing has. Nevertheless, we know there's no mistake in Euclid's proof. We must therefore believe that there is some proposition that's consistent with there being nothing icosahedral, and yet can be what Euclid proved. Well, we might insist that since there are no shapes that nothing has, and Euclid's conclusion is true, there must be icosahedral objects somewhere. We might contend, that is, that Euclid's theorem is an a priori proof of the existence of physical things of a certain shape. But I really don't think that the following is a very persuasive argument. Since Euclid's conclusion is true, and there can't be shapes that nothing has, there must be icosahedral objects somewhere. Maybe they're too small to see, or they're very far away, or maybe they already exist as undetached parts of various things, in the way the Cnidian Aphrodite already existed as a part of a block of marble before Praxiteles chipped away the rest of the block. I don't think that doesn't persuade me that there has to be icosahedral objects. Well, might someone say then that there are no actual icosahedral things, but there's plenty of possible ones. There's plenty of merely possible ones. There's plenty of icosahedral things that don't actually exist, but would have existed if the course of history had gone slightly differently. So, but what we're being told is there are things that might exist but don't exist. But there are things, then there are things that don't exist. What's the difference between there are and exist? It sounds like the person is telling us that there are things such that there are no such things, or that there exist things that don't exist. That seems an obvious contradiction. Well, how about this then? Someone says, look, we can use the idea of the merely possible to reconcile the validity of Euclid's proof with our conviction that there are no shapes that nothing has, even if we can't do it in the way set out in the previous suggestion. We can state Euclid's conclusion as follows. Let's say that, well, I'm going to define a predicate is Platonic that applies to physical, tangible physical objects. I'll just do it by example. A cubical block of stone would be a Platonic thing. You can buy icosahedral dice online. Try it. They're right there. Each of them is Platonic. And any octahedron or any cube, any physical object, they're all Platonic. Well, if we have this predicate of physical things that are disposable, we can state Euclid's conclusion as possible, as this way. Look, this is possible. It's possible for there to be 5 distinct Platonic things, each of which is a different shape from the others. And it's not possible for there to be 6 distinct Platonic things, each of which is a different shape from the others. That's a very powerful suggestion, because in some sense it seems to say everything about the world that the statement there are exactly 5 Platonic solids says, and it does not assert the existence of anything. It just says it's possible for there to be certain things. If you say that, you're not asserting the existence of anything. And therefore, it doesn't assert the existence of shapes that nothing has. So we could say, if we talk about people who deny the existence of abstract objects as nominalists, we could say that this is a nominalistically acceptable paraphrase of the statement there are exactly 5 Platonic solids. That is, there are 5 Platonic solids. That looks like it asserts the existence of things nominalists wouldn't like. But to say that there could be 5 Platonic physical things all different from each other and that there couldn't be 6, that doesn't seem, since that doesn't assert the existence of anything, it's certainly acceptable to nominalists. So it's a powerful suggestion, but it's not an ultimately workable one, I think. And here's the reason why. While Euclid's theorem about the Platonic solids can, I concede, be given this nominalistically acceptable paraphrase, not every step in his proof of it can. Now, I can't go into that within the scope of the talk, but I could say something about how the proof works a little bit later if you want to talk about that. And no one knows of any other proof of the theorem where every step in the proof could be given a nominalistically acceptable paraphrase. Now, cases like that have led some philosophers to adopt a position called mathematical fictionalism, a position that would imply that although there are intermediate steps in Euclid's proof that are false statements, a person said, yep, it's a perfectly good proof. I admit that it contains false statements on the way to the conclusion, but they're a useful fiction. They're useful, they happen never, although they're false themselves, they never lead to false conclusions, so we'll adopt them as a fiction. I think mathematical fictionalism is a non-starter. If you want to know why, you can ask me during the question period. All right. You can't go through and accept each step of Euclid's proof of the theorem, there are exactly 5 Platonic solids, without asserting the existence of shapes, or at least of something that nominalists are not going to like any better than shapes, maybe ways of constructing three-dimensional figures or possible shapes, whatever you call them, they're going to be something that nominalists don't like. And then if there are shapes at all, there's obviously such a shape as the icosahedron. And that shape is a shape that, remember, we're still back here in 270 BC. We think it's a shape, think it's a shape nothing has. So, all right, there are shapes that nothing has. Well, we can't say that nowadays because we know actually that there are some icosahedral things, even if they're too small to see. And anyway, we've made icosahedral artifacts since then. But still, it looks obvious, doesn't it, that there are shapes that nothing has. Suppose I have a piece of clay in my hands. I'm working it into different shapes with my hands. Obviously, I don't work it into all possible shapes with my hands. There's not enough time in the history and future of the universe. So there are vastly many shapes that this piece of clay could have that it doesn't have and nothing will ever have in the whole history, in the whole future of the universe. And not only can a shape exist if nothing has it, but every shape, I say, is necessarily existent. That every shape wouldn't exist no matter what. No shape could have failed to exist, because take the cube. Is there a possible way the world could be that there was no such shape as the cube? I don't mean no cubes. Of course there could have been no cubes. But could there have been no such shape as the cube for things to be? That would be, to imagine that, is to imagine a world in which there couldn't possibly be something cubical. Well, in our world there are things that are cubical. So we're imagining a state of affairs in which our actual state of affairs is a simple state of affairs. Now, I agree that our actual state of affairs might not have been actual. Everybody but Spinoza believes that. But our state of affairs might not even have been possible. I hold it as a metaphysical axiom that if a state of affairs is actual, then it has to be at least possible. Or think of matters this way. According to Orthodox Christian theology, God might not have chosen to create, might have chosen not to create anything. He had absolute will, free will, in the matter of creation. Well, suppose God had chosen that option. Then there would be nothing besides himself. Since God is obviously not cubical, then there would have been nothing cubical. Still, let's shift to the indicative mood. God knows about cubical things as possibilities. That is, he knows that he has the power to create a universe, some of whose constituent objects are cubes. So he must know about the shape, the cube. He must contemplate that shape and form the consequent judgment, I could have created things of that shape, for the simple reason that if he did not contemplate that shape and form that judgment, he would not fully be aware of every aspect of his power. And of course, if God contemplates a shape, then there is a shape that he is contemplating. Did he create that shape that he is contemplating? Well, obviously not if he hasn't created anything, right? And that's the state of affairs we're imagining. But leave that difficult case to one side and ask whether he created the cube in our world, in the actual world. I'm not asking whether he created cubes. Of course he created cubes. He created all of them. I'm asking whether he created the shape itself. Well, it's kind of hard to imagine God deciding whether to create the shape, the cube. I mean, it must be before his mind. If he's deciding to create Adam, say, he can look at sort of the Adam blueprint in his mind and decide whether to create somebody that corresponds to that blueprint. But a shape is more like an abstract blueprint. You can't have a blueprint of a blueprint. The shape has to be there as a sort of for things. Now, I'm perfectly comfortable. And anyway, what would it be to create a shape? That is, what would it be for a shape to be created? I mean, a shape is just a shape. It's a possibility of there being physical things of a certain, shape. I don't see what it would mean to bring such a thing into existence. I can't see how the concept of being brought into existence or being held in existence or its existence depending on something, I can't see how that could apply to a shape. I am perfectly comfortable with saying both that shapes are uncreated and, as I do every Sunday, we believe in one God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth and of all things, visible and invisible. And a moment later, speaking of Jesus Christ, through him all things were made. I am comfortable affirming both that shapes are not brought into being by God and my allegiance to these words from the prologue to the fourth gospel. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. I'm comfortable with both my thesis, and these words from Creed and Scripture for essentially the same reason that I'm comfortable both with affirming, along with almost every other Christian philosopher and theologian, both the following thesis. Consider this thesis now. There are many things that God cannot do. He cannot create something that is simultaneously a ball and a cube. He cannot change the past. He cannot bring his own existence to an end. He cannot break a promise he has made. And the proposition that the following gospel passages are inerrant scripture. For human beings, such a thing is impossible, but for God, everything is possible. Matthew 19:26. Nothing whatever that God ordained shall be impossible. Luke 13:1-37. Thomas Aquinas has said, nothing that implies a contradiction falls under the omnipotence of God, which certainly implies that God is not able to create a cubical sphere or a spherical cube. Is he contradicting the words of Jesus there? No one has ever supposed so. And of course, the reason is presumably something like the reason, to say that he would be like, you listen to a shopkeeper say, boy, what a day. We sold everything in the store. And you say, oh, why did you sell the counter and the cash register? Won't you need them tomorrow? Well, I didn't mean things like that. I meant the things that were for sale. Well, you said everything in the store. They're in the store, aren't they? That is, sometimes they're understood, when we say all or every, there are understood restrictions on the kinds of thing you're talking about. In my view, when we say that God is the creator of all things, we are talking about things like seas and mountains and storms and the sun and the moon, galaxies and time and space and electromagnetic creation, neutrinos, dark energy, and angels and human souls. I don't think that we mean, at any rate that we have to mean, that he is the creator of abstract objects, of things like propositions and attributes and numbers and shapes. Dr. Craig will try to convince you that we have to mean just that. If he convinces you of this, I will try to unconvince you. Thank you.
Central to classical theism is the conception of God as the sole, ultimate reality, the creator of all things apart from himself. Such a doctrine is rooted in Hebrew Christian scripture. To select but one text, in the prologue of the Gospel of John, we read, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being." John 1, 1-3. The evangelist gives us to understand that God, through his word, is responsible for the existence of literally everything other than God himself. Apart from God, every existent belongs to the creaturely realm, the class of things which have come into being, in the Greek geneta, and so owe their existence to God's creative word, logos, who is later identified as Christ. John 1, 1-3 is thus fraught with metaphysical significance. For taken prima facie, it tells us that God alone exists eternally and a se. It entails that there are no objects of any sort which are co-eternal with God and uncreated by God. The strongest challenge to the traditional doctrine of divine aseity comes from the philosophy of Platonism. Although contemporary Platonism differs vastly from classical Platonism in various respects, both views are united in holding that there exist uncreated entities other than God, for example, mathematical objects. Would-be Christian Platonists must maintain that John's domain of quantification is restricted in such a way that abstract objects escape his universally quantified statements. Now, it's important that we understand clearly the question before us, since it is so often misunderstood. The question is not, did John have abstract objects in mind when he said, "All things came into being through him"? Probably not. But by the same token, neither did he have in mind quarks, galaxies, and black holes. Yet he would doubtless take such things, and countless other things were he informed about them, to have been created by God and to be in the class of things he is talking about. The question is not what John thought lay in the domain of his quantifiers. Rather, the question is whether John intends the domain of his quantification, once God is exempted, to be unrestricted. Does he think that apart from God, everything else that exists is created by God? It is more than probable that he did. For God's status as the only eternal, uncreated being is an earmark of first-century Judaism. In his influential work on the character of ancient Jewish monotheism, Richard Bauckham identifies two characteristics that uniquely mark off Israel's God from all others, namely, that he is the creator of all things and sovereign ruler of all things. There is in the Judaism of John's day a bright dividing line which separates God ontologically from everything else, a bifurcation which Bauckham attempts to capture by the term transcendent uniqueness. God's status as the sole, ultimate reality comes to practical expression in the Jewish restriction of worship as properly directed toward God alone. According to Bauckham, this restriction most clearly signaled the distinction between God and all other reality. The crucial point here is that the unrestrictedness of the domain of quantification is based not in what kinds of objects were thought to lie in the domain, but rather in the Jewish doctrine of God as the only being which exists eternally and a se. It is who, or what God is, that requires that the domain of quantification be unrestricted, whatever beings might be discovered to lie in the domain. John himself identifies the word logos alone as existing with God and being God in the beginning. The creation of everything else through the divine logos then follows. Bauckham calls such a view Christological monotheism. The divine Logos is on God's side of the dividing line between God and the rest of reality. Indeed, given the striking similarities of John's Logos doctrine to that of the Alexandrian Jewish philosopher Philo, whose dates are 20 BC to AD 50, it is not at all implausible that John, like Philo, thought that the intelligible realm, the so-called cosmos noetos, of what we would today call abstract objects, was contained in the divine Logos, so that creation comprised only concrete objects. Be that as it may, there is no reason to doubt that John believed that every existing thing apart from God had come into being through the Logos. To postulate an infinite plenitude of abstract objects as real as planets, existing independently of God, so that the realm of concrete objects brought into being by God is literally infinitesimal by comparison, would betray Jewish monotheism and trivialize the doctrine of creation. So I think it clear that John did intend his domain of quantification to include everything apart from God, whatever idea he may have had concerning what objects lay in the domain. The evangelist's conviction that God is the creator of everything that exists aside from God eventually attained creedal status at the Council of Nicaea. In language redolent of the prologue to the fourth gospel and of Paul, the council affirmed, "I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and of all things, visible and invisible, and in one Lord, Jesus Christ, the only Son of God, begotten of the Father before all ages, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, consubstantial with the Father, through whom all things came into being." At face value, the council affirms that God alone is uncreated and that all else was created by him. An examination of ante-Nicene theological reflection on divine aseity confirms the prima facie reading. At the heart of the Arian controversy which occasioned the convening of the Council of Nicaea lay a pair of terminological distinctions prevalent among the church fathers. Agenetas, genetas with a single N or single nu in the Greek, and agenetas, genetas with a double N or double nu. The word pair agenetas, genetas with a single nu derives from the verb ginomai, which means to become or to come into being. Agenetas means unoriginated or uncreated, in contrast to genetas, that which is created or originated. The second word pair, agenetas, genetas with the double nu, derives from the verb genao, which means to beget. That which is agenetas is unbegotten, while that which is genetas is begotten. These distinctions allowed the fathers to hold that while both God the Father and God the Son are agenetas with a single nu, only the Father is agenetas with the double nu. The ante-Nicene and Nicene church fathers, like the Arian heretics, rejected any suggestion that there might exist ageneta apart from God alone. According to the patristic scholar Harry Ostrom Wolfson, the church fathers all accepted the following three principles. 1, God alone is uncreated. 2, nothing is co-eternal with God. And 3, eternality implies deity. Each of these principles implies that there are no ageneta apart from God. But lest it be suggested that abstracta were somehow exempted from these principles, we should note that the ante-Nicene church fathers explicitly rejected the view that entities such as properties and numbers are ageneta. The fathers were familiar with the metaphysical worldviews of Plato and Pythagoras and agreed with them that there is one agenetos from which all reality derives. But the fathers identified this agenetos not with an impersonal form or number, but with the Hebrew God, who has created all things other than himself ex nihilo. If confronted by a modern-day Platonist defending an ontology which included causally effete objects which were ageneta and so co-eternal with God, they would have rejected such an account as blasphemous, since such an account would impugn God's unique aseity and undermine creatio ex nihilo by denying that God is the universal ground of being. The fathers could not therefore exempt such objects from God's creative power, since he is the sole and all originating agenetos. I have belabored this point because the grounds of my rejection of Platonism are not philosophical, but theological. I press no philosophical objections against Platonism. Rather, rejecting Quine's epistemological naturalism, I raise theological objections to the Platonic worldview. I thus find myself in agreement with Professor van Inwagen, though for different reasons, that the Christian philosopher at least, quote, should not believe in abstract objects unless he feels rationally compelled by some weighty consideration or argument. A philosopher should wish not to be a Platonist if it's rationally possible for the informed philosopher not to be a Platonist, end quote. Only if anti-Platonism were rationally impossible to hold, only if there is a rationally compelling argument for Platonism, should the Christian philosopher feel torn to abandon his theological commitment to God's being the sole ultimate reality. It hardly needs to be said that there is no such argument. The principal argument offered on behalf of Platonism comes in the various incarnations of the Quine-Putnam indispensability argument. Premise 1, as summarized or schematized by Mark Balaguer, if a simple sentence, that is a sentence of the form A is F, is literally true, then the objects that its singular terms denote exist. Likewise, if an existential sentence, for example, there is an F, is literally true, then there exist objects of the relevant kinds. Premise 2, there are literally true simple sentences containing singular terms that refer to things that could only be abstract objects. Likewise, there are literally true existential statements whose existential quantifiers range over things that could only be abstract objects. 3, therefore, abstract objects exist. Premise 1 is a meta-ontological thesis expressing a criterion of ontological commitment. 2 is the affirmation that abstract discourse is to be construed as literally true. How might the Christian philosopher respond to the indispensability argument? Taking mathematical objects as a case in point, Figure 1 displays some of the many options. The various options can be classed as realist, that is, say mathematical objects exist, anti-realist, mathematical objects do not exist, or a-realist. There is no fact of the matter concerning the existence of mathematical objects. Let's look first at the realist branch. As Figure 1 illustrates, there are two brands of realism about mathematical objects: views which take them to be concrete objects and views which take them to be abstract objects. Of realist views which consider mathematical objects to be abstract, Absolute creationism is a sort of modified Platonism, holding that mathematical objects have, like concrete objects, been created by God, thus safeguarding divine aseity. Concretist versions of realism can take mathematical objects to be either physical objects or mental objects, the latter either in human minds or in God's mind. The most promising concretist view is some sort of divine conceptualism, the heir to the view of Philo and the Church Fathers, according to which there are no mathematical objects independent of God. Moving left to right, we next come to a-realism, the view that there just is no fact of the matter about the reality of mathematical objects. The classical version of a-realism was the conventionalism of Rudolf Carnap. No philosopher today would defend Carnap's verificationism, but his conventionalism does find an echo today in what we might call ontological pluralism. According to thinkers of this persuasion, certain ontological questions, though meaningful, do not have objective answers. Some non-realists, notably the philosophers of mathematics, Marc Balaguer and Penelope Matty, would deny that the question, do mathematical objects exist, has an answer that is objectively true or false. Now, at first blush, realism might seem a quick and easy solution to the challenge posed by Platonism to divine aseity. Alas, however, there is no succor for the theist here. For given God's metaphysical necessity and essential aseity, there just is no possible world in which uncreated mathematical objects exist. Hence, there most certainly is a fact of the matter whether uncreated abstract objects exist. They do not and cannot exist. Therefore, a-realism is necessarily false. When we turn to anti-realist responses to the indispensability argument, we find a cornucopia of different views. Neutralism rejects the criterion of ontological commitment expressed in premise 1, taking the use of singular terms and existential quantification to be neutral with respect to ontological commitments. Fictionalism accepts the Platonist criterion of ontological commitment, but denies that mathematical statements are true. Figuralism holds that mathematical discourse is true, but denies that it must be taken literally. Neo-Meinongianism holds that there are objects referred to by abstract singular terms, but takes these objects to be non-existent. Pretense theory considers mathematical discourse to be a species of make-believe, so that mathematical objects are akin to fictional characters. Paraphrastic strategies, like Charles Chihara's constructibilism or Jeffrey Hellman's modal structuralism, holds that we can offer paraphrases of mathematical statements which will preserve their truth value without ontological commitment to abstract objects, and so on. In order to overcome the presumption which anti-Platonism enjoys theologically, the Platonist will have to show that all of these other positions are rationally impossible to hold, that all the informed philosophers espousing such positions are irrational in doing so. No one has even attempted so audacious a project, nor is there any reasonable expectation that it could be carried out. Had time permitted, I should like to have shared which anti-realist view, or combination thereof, I find the most persuasive. For that, you'll have to read the book. But the more important task here today was to explain why I think you should not be a Platonist, and then to open up some options on how you might avoid it.
The audience, that's you, will note that much of what I say this evening will refer to Thomas Aquinas, or to one of the philosophers working in the Thomistic tradition. At SCS, our philosophical perspective is one of existential Thomism. Although Aquinas' philosophy is still regarded in areas such as the philosophy of religion and ethics, it's typically ignored in metaphysics, epistemology, or the philosophy of mind. These latter categories are very much in play as one considers the problem of God and abstract objects. As I approach a resolution to the problem, I shall do so from the Thomistic tradition. I have two goals for this evening, which I will state explicitly. One is a minimum, the other is a maximum. At the minimum, I want the audience to accept that the Thomistic solution to the problem of God and abstract objects is worthy of consideration. That is, even if one disagrees with some elements of the solution, one will agree that it is a valid response to the problem. At the maximum, I will try and demonstrate not only that the Thomistic position is valid, but superior to the realist or the anti-realist alternatives. That is, the Thomistic account satisfies all of one's intuitions about the facts of the matter. Before moving on, I should say something about what makes for a good philosophical solution to a philosophical problem. Imagine a ball with a board laid over the top of it. The ball represents reality, and the board some philosophical account of reality. Notice there are places where initially the board and the ball touch, but as the ball curves away, the board just keeps jutting out awkwardly to the side. There are positions in philosophy, perhaps Berkeley's idealism, that though they begin by tracking with reality, they follow the necessities of their philosophical account as it juts away from the real. A good philosophical solution is more like a cloth draped over the ball. In our philosophically reflective account of reality, as reality curves away, our account of reality should keep pace. It should follow with it so that it is consistent with some of our most basic common sense intuitions. Having said something about my minimum and maximum goals and what makes for a good philosophical solution, I now want to paint some broad outlines of the issue so that I can situate the Thomistic Moderate Realist position in its confines. Dr. Van Inwagen is a realist about abstract objects. These are entities that exist, are eternal, causally inert universals. Dr. Craig is a concretist, or an anti-realist about abstract objects, denies that such entities exist. The Thomistic Moderate Realist position is that abstract objects, or abstractions, exist, but only as objects abstracted by the intellect. And they have the properties that they do as a result of the way the intellect grasps its objects. While it is true that the Thomistic position occupies a middle ground between realism and anti-realism, that does not of itself make it a stronger position. I take it, for example, that theistic evolution is something of a midway between full-blown creationism and, say, atheistic evolution. But just because it occupies a middle position doesn't make it a strong position. And in this case, I think it actually absorbs weaknesses of both accounts. What we should see tonight, however, is not only does Aquinas occupy the middle position, but the position possesses the strengths of both realism and anti-realism and none of its weaknesses. As such, it is the superior position. What then are the strengths and weaknesses of Platonism and Nominalism, or anti-realism? One of the strengths of the Platonist position is that it has a way to make sense of attribute agreement in a more or less direct way. That is, when I say the tomato is red and the apple is red, this is the nefarious redness that Dr. Howe referred to. When I say the tomato is red and the apple is red, there is something common that the tomato and the apple have in common, namely their redness. They have this attribute in common because there is a numerically one redness, which is an abstract object, that is exemplified both by the tomato and the apple. One of the great weaknesses of Platonism is the so-called two-world ontology. Dr. Van Inwagen has commented on this, writing, quote, "Platonists, therefore, must say that reality, what there is divided into two parts. One part we belong to, and everything in this part is more like us than anything in the other part. The inhabitants of the other part are radically unlike us, much more unlike us than anything in our part. And we can't really say much about what the things in the other part are like, that is, in the Platonic realm. It seems to me evident that it would be better not to believe in the other part of reality if we could manage it, but we can't," end quote. Besides the weakness of the two-world ontology, Platonism has another weakness of particular interest to the Christian philosopher, namely that it commits him to a realm of entities existing eternally alongside God without being caused to exist by God. Such a position does seem to violate a straightforward understanding of the doctrines of aseity and sovereignty. Since Dr. Craig has expressed himself on this weakness of Platonism for the Christian philosopher, I will avoid elaborating on it any further. These then would be good reasons not to hold to Platonism if possible. As Dr. Van Inwagen has also written, quote, "If we call the thesis that there are abstract objects Platonism, my conclusion is that a philosopher should not wish to be a Platonist if it's rationally possible for the informed philosopher not to be a Platonist," end quote. While I agree with Dr. Van Inwagen that there are reasons that one should not be a Platonist, I do not see Platonism as unavoidable or nominalism as the only alternative. I believe the moderate realist account can meet Dr. Van Inwagen's challenge. One might think that in rejecting Platonism, the most obvious philosophical position would be nominalism or anti-realism, that is, the rejection of abstract objects. This position, however, has strengths and weaknesses of its own. One strength of the anti-realist position is that it avoids the two-world ontology, and so gives us a philosophical view of reality that's simpler or cleaner than the one offered by the Platonist. One weakness of anti-realism, obviously enough, is that it has to give account of things like attribute agreement, of red tomatoes and red apples, without positing abstract entities. Now, nominalists do this in a variety of ways: metalinguistic nominalism, trope nominalism. But even if these responses are sufficient, there is still a dilemma in the neighborhood for the Christian philosopher who espouses anti-realism. Now, the dilemma is set in motion by an insight from Dr. Van Inwagen. He writes, quote, "What reasons are there for believing in the existence of properties, qualities, attributes, etc.? I think it's fair to say that there are apparently such things as properties. There is, for example, apparently such a thing as humanity. The members of the class of human being, as the idiom has it, have something in common. This appears to be an existential proposition, and of course, what goes for the class of human beings goes for the class of birds, the class of white things, the class of intermediate vector bosons, whatever those are. The members of each of these classes have something in common with one another," end quote. I think Dr. Van Inwagen is correct here. That is, one's treatment of humanity is similar to one's treatment of all other general classes, for example, whiteness. Dr. Craig has written, quote, "The nominalist rejects the Platonist ontological assay of things. Fleet feet and brown dogs exist, but the brownness and the fleetness are purely fictitious entities," end quote. To be fair, Dr. Craig has resisted the label of nominalist, and for the problem of objects, he's opted for the clearer concretism, according to which only concrete objects exist and abstract objects do not, at least uncreated abstract objects do not. But he does write with some strong nominalist sympathies, and so if not strictly a nominalist, his position retains certain elements common with nominalism that do not avoid the present dilemma, and the dilemma is this. Remember, for the Christian philosopher. Either one allows for the common nature of humanity, or one does not. If one does, then as Dr. Van Inwagen has asserted, one lets into one's ontology, if not all, a good portion of the Platonic horde that the nominalist typically wants to bar. If one does not allow for the common nature of humanity, then for the Christian philosopher, it becomes much more difficult to give a coherent account of three core doctrines: original sin, the incarnation, and redemption. After all, if there's nothing that makes me metaphysically the same kind of being as Adam, then how is it that Adam's fall is somehow transferred to me? If there is no such thing as humanity, then how do we make sense of Christ being the last Adam, or taking on human nature? Finally, if there's no common nature between the incarnate Christ and myself, then how is it that Christ's death redeems my humanity? These are problems for the nominalist Christian philosopher. These then are the strengths and the weaknesses of the realist and anti-realist positions related to the problem of God and abstract objects. What remains to be seen is how the moderate realist position retains the strengths and avoids the weaknesses. In the following somewhat lengthy quote from Thomistic philosopher Edward Feser, Feser will explain how the moderate realist view of universals, abstract objects, differs from Platonism, nominalism, and conceptualism. So bear with me. Feser writes, quote, Consider a universal like animality, that is the feature of being an animal. Animality cannot be said to exist as a substance or a thing in its own right. That is to say, it cannot be said to be a Platonic form. How then does it exist? In the real mind-independent world, it exists only in actual animals. There is animality in Socrates, but there it is inseparably tied to his rationality, and specifically to his humanness. And there is animality in Phaedo, but it is there inseparably tied to non-rationality, specifically to dogness. Animality, considered an abstraction from these things, exists only in the mind. The senses observe this or that individual man, this or that individual dog. The intellect abstracts away the differentiating features of each and considers the animality in isolation, as a universal. This is not nominalism, for it holds that universals exist in some way. Nor is it conceptualism, for while it holds that universals considered an abstraction from other features exist only in the mind, it also holds that they exist in the extramental things, and that the abstracted universals existing in the intellect derive from our sense experiences, rather than being free creations of the mind, as they would be in conceptualism. End quote. Notice that although similar, the Thomistic position is not identical to conceptualism. What Fazer has just explained in a concise way is that what the Platonist takes to be entities existing outside the mind in some Platonic realm are actually features of things in the world that, when abstracted by the intellect, take on those features in intellection that the Platonist attributes to abstract objects. I have a quote from Thomas Aquinas that hopefully will make this clearer. If not, then just hang on. All right. Aquinas says this, quote, "Plato strayed from the truth because he believed that the form of the thing known must necessarily be in the knower exactly as it is in the thing known." Now, he recognized that the form of the thing understood in the intellect, the form is understood in the intellect in a universal, immaterial, and unchanging way. Thus, Plato concluded that the things understood must exist in themselves in the same way, namely universal, immaterial, unchanging. The intellect receives material, changeable things in an immaterial, unchanging way, in accordance with its nature, for things are received in a subject according to the nature of the subject. We must conclude, therefore, that the soul knows material things through the intellect with a knowledge that is immaterial, universal, and necessary. End quote. This idea of the intellect obtaining its objects in a mode different from the way they exist in reality should be familiar to us from an analogy with sense perception. For example, we say things like, the stick looks bent in water, but we know it's not really bent. Or, the thing looks really small because it's so far away from us. What Aquinas is saying is that the human knower has two knowing powers, sensation and intellection. Via sensation, the human comes into contact with a concrete particular. Via intellection, the human abstracts features from things that they have in common and grasps them in an immaterial, universal way. Notice, however, that these are two knowing powers of a unified person, not two different knowledges. Frederick Wilhelmsen writes this, quote, "Sense and intellect are not distinct entities at war with each other. They are powers of a single knowing subject, and through their mutual interpenetration, the intellect sees the universal in the singular." End quote. Though most philosophers are aware that sensation can give us false impressions of reality, for example, sticks bent in water, some contemporary philosophers pay little attention to how it is that an object known under the conditions of an abstracting intellect can also give false impressions that become false metaphysical data, as it were. This, so Aquinas thinks, is what's going on for the Platonists regarding abstract objects. It is the intellect's particular way of grasping things that it abstracts universals from the individuating material conditions. The intellect, as it were, strips out forms or intelligible species in things that are metaphysical principles of its being, substantial and accidental forms, but in the mind are grasped apart from the conditions of individuation and considered in abstraction. This is why white in things is a particular quality. But in the intellect, white is taken up not as a particular quality inherent in a substance, but it is taken up as whiteness. Under the conditions of the intellect, it becomes a universal, even though that's not what it is in the world. The same is true of humanity. There is humanity in the individual human being, but there it is a substantial form. It is a metaphysical principle that makes the human what he is. Humanity doesn't exist outside the mind, but as abstracted by the intellect, it becomes humanity, the universal. There's a difference in the philosopher having a stone in his mind and, say, Goliath having a stone in his head. The stone, in order to be grasped by the intellect, must be grasped immaterially and apart from its material constraints. And when it's grasped in this way, it takes on the features of universality. This is why the Thomists can affirm with the staunchest nominalist that the only things that exist outside the mind are concrete particulars, while also recognizing that in two white things, for example, or two human things, there's a common nature, which is some formal identity that is individuated, materially and existentially. It is the intellect's role in human knowing to strip forms from reality. Only a philosophy of mind, epistemology, and philosophy of nature that integrates these elements, the human knower with an eye to how things look to the intellect, how things are grasped in intellection, can resolve the conflict between the Platonic realist and the nominalist anti-realist. This moderate realism will recognize the contributions to human knowing that are unique to sensation and to intellection. The moderate realist position is able to account for the common nature between humans without there being abstract objects as separately existing entities. Without a moderate realist philosophy of nature, philosophy of mind, epistemology, I don't see how much of the contemporary debate can be resolved, although a recent article by Jeffrey Brower is a large step toward this. With these distinctions, I think it can be solved fairly easily. Since Thomistic Moderate Realism is not a form of nominalism, Dr. Van Inwagen could admit that it is a philosophically informed alternative to Platonism while still maintaining that nominalism is an inconsistent position. Dr. Craig, because he's open to other anti-realist solutions, such as conceptualism, could admit that moderate realism is a viable candidate for a solution to the problem of God and abstract objects. With all of this, it is important to keep in mind as well the tendencies that a philosopher develops when being trained in a particular tradition. W.P. Quine writes, quote, "Our acceptance of an ontology," and that's what you're here to do tonight, you're here to think about ontological positions. Our acceptance of an ontology is, I think, similar in principle to our acceptance of a scientific theory, say a system of physics. We adopt, at least insofar as we are reasonable, the simplest conceptual scheme into which the disordered fragments of raw experience can be fitted and arranged. Philosopher of science A.F. Chalmers writes something similar. He says, "Supporters of rival paradigms will not accept each other's premises, and so will not necessarily be convinced by each other's arguments," end quote. Quine and Chalmers' ideas combine to explain why it is common for interlocutors in a dialogue such as this do not have as our goal to convince one another. That's perhaps impossible. Rather, it is the open-minded agnostic in the audience who is the primary candidate for being convinced of the reasonability of one position over another. I think the Thomist solution to this problem should have that feeling of the cloth laid over the ball. At least it should have enough of this appeal for me to have accomplished my minimum goal in defending the viability of the Thomist solution to the problem, and perhaps going a step towards showing the superiority of it. On a personal note, one thing that I've learned in preparation for this dialogue is that deep and abiding philosophical disagreement is no barrier to professional admiration. I greatly admire what Drs. Craig and Van Inwagen have accomplished in their careers. I acknowledge that, as well as their acknowledgement that the apologetics task is an important practical extension of philosophical study. Though the problem of God and abstract objects may seem to many a remote intellectual concern, I believe that Dr. Craig is correct in lingering over its theological importance. SES is one of those unique places where we attempt to integrate as closely as possible these two pursuits, the one properly academic, the other practical ministry. I'd like to thank SES for hosting the event, to Dr. Craig for suggesting it, and to both Drs. Craig and Dr. Van Inwagen for participating. It is a great event for our school and our students, and on a final personal note, to the students that I have this semester, especially in metaphysics, who I've been flogging through some of my own reflections this semester, you get a special thanks as well.
All right, we're going to take just a few minutes, let the speakers stretch their legs, you stretch your legs. You might want to make a mad dash for one of the restrooms, but good luck. There'll probably be a line at all of them. And we'll try to get going as quickly as possible. I'll look to Mr. Gustafson to give me a cue, and then I'll pull us all back in order. So don't wander too far off. I would like to take the moderator's privilege of throwing out a question to the three of you, just to kind of get the ball rolling. No deference necessarily to Dr. Van Inwagen, but a term that has been used by all three of you throughout the evening in various cognates, verbs like exist, or existing, or nouns like being, or beings, or gerunds. I would like to hear from the three of you, and I don't really care which order that you go in. Taking a cue from Professor Van Inwagen's comment from his paper that a shape that nothing has, I presume he doesn't mean that nothing is something that has a certain shape, but rather that there is not a thing that has that shape, from which it follows that then there is this shape that exists independently of these things. How do you unpack, and I'm asking this for all three of you, however you take his position and then depart from that in the ways that you might. What do you mean when you talk about whether or not an abstract object does or does not exist? Are we using the term exist univocally when we talk about whether an abstract object does or does not exist versus, let's say, whether the Loch Ness Monster does or does not exist? Do you think it's profitable to explore because we talk about things that talk about things that are that don't exist, and so we must be using the word the copula, in more than one way, at least some in the conversation. So who would like to go first? It doesn't really matter to me. We haven't heard from you in a while, so do you want to get us kicked off?
I don't think do we say there are things that don't exist? Well, maybe.
Well, what I was thinking, just to make sure my question was clear, that there are shapes that no thing has. So either that shape is not a thing.
No, the shape is a thing. The shape exists. I said there are shapes that no tangible physical thing
Okay,
has.
all right. Anyway, go ahead if you want to do it.
Yes, and yes, I would consider existence and being to be both synonymous and univocal. So yes, if a Platonist like me says that there exists a number such that none of the next billion numbers is prime, then he or she is using exist in the same sense as he would use it if he said that God exists, or a possibility for a durable agreement in the Middle East exists, or the Loch Ness Monster doesn't exist, or that is, there's only one thing for exist to mean. I think it's something exists if there is such a thing as it. Something exists if the number of things that are it is at least one, and I guess it can't be more than one, so something exists if it is itself. There's the trouble with this verb is that it's one of the more basic verbs in our vocabulary, and we can't really find more basic materials with which to define it. Mm-hmm. But I think the important thing in what I said is that I regard exist as univocal.
This is univocal, and maybe we can, as we go along, it'll become more obvious what to be univocal or otherwise means in this context. Dr. Craig?
Yeah. It seems to me that Peter's right in saying that this is a sort of primitive term, and if you could answer the question, what is existence? That's the $64,000 philosophical question.
Noted.
But what Quine's meta-ontological guides for settling ontological disputes did was not offer a definition of existence or to tell us what exists, but rather it exploits the notion of what your discourse commits you to ontologically. That if you utter or assert a statement that you are ontologically committed to the values of the variables that are bound by the first order logical quantifiers and by the reference of the singular terms that appear in the sentence. That's that criterion that is in the first premise of the indispensability argument that I talked about. So I don't think we need to define existence in order to explore the question of what our ontological commitments are. And I think that Dr. Van Inwagen is right in saying that exists and being is univocal. But I would insist that the notion of existence in ordinary language is a very lightweight notion, and that very often in ordinary speech we say things exist but aren't meant to be taken in a metaphysically heavyweight sense. For example, we might say, well, there exists opposition to the plan, or there exist drawbacks in what you propose. And we're not making a metaphysical commitment to the existence of oppositions and drawbacks. So in natural languages, the word exists, I think, though univocal, is very lightweight. And so we need something to disclose to us exactly what it is that we're committing ourselves to ontologically.
All right, thank you. Dr. Bridges?
Well, I mentioned in my opening that that we, or at least I, am an existential Thomist. We're open to all kinds of Thomists here. So we're very broad-minded in that. Yeah, so I would agree with Dr. Craig and Van Inwagen that the notion of existence is univocal. That is, we don't mean something different when we say the virus exists or that the plane or that the earth exists. But Aquinas makes a distinction between the notion of being, that is the conceptualization of being, which is univocal, and the act of being, which is analogical. So for example, if I say the three of us exist, I don't mean anything different when I say Dr. Craig exists from when I say Dr. Van Inwagen exists. But our actual existence, the actual act of being by which we exist every moment of our existing, is analogical. That is, Dr. Van Inwagen's act of being is to him what Dr. Craig's act of being is to him, and what my act of being is to me. Right? And so, and we can show this by, if one of them passed out of existence, we'll just charitably say me. If I were to pass out of existence, and the actual act of being that we all have was univocal, we would all pass out of existence. Right? The fact that I cannot exist and they can go on happily existing shows that although the notion is univocal, the actual act of existing is analogical.
Now, what I want to do is give these gentlemen a chance to query one another. And so I don't care which order we go in, and I don't really care too much about who you direct your query to, but if you've got a sort of a follow-up from what you've heard tonight, and there's a question burning in your loins, without committing myself to the actual ontology of loins, then I'd like to open that up. So Dr. Craig, why don't we start with you?
All right.
Since Dr.
Let me ask Peter a kind of softball question so that students can understand more clearly your argument for Platonism. in the paper you say that if there are shapes, then there are shapes which nothing has. Now, it might appear that we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here. First, it would seem appropriate to prove that there are shapes which something has, because the anti-realist denies that. He will say there are approximately cubical objects in the world and approximately spherical objects and objects that are approximately icosahedral. Yes. But that doesn't mean that there is, in addition to that, a mind-independent object, the cube, or the sphere, or the icosahedron. What argument would you give to show that these things exist in addition to these physical objects that I described?
Well, let's start with Euclid's proof that there are 5 Platonic solids. It's a correct piece of mathematics. How are we to understand the conclusion? Well, I showed you a way to understand the conclusion that's consistent with nominalism, right? So, but I said, but unfortunately, you can't really understand all the steps in the proof that way. They're not amenable to the kind of paraphrase that the conclusion is. So, sometime you're going through the proof, and you'll come to some step in the proof where Euclid said, next we have this, and you say, wait, I can't accept that, I'm a nominalist. And I say, what business is it of a metaphysician to tell a mathematician he can't say something in the course of proof? But my general, I don't exactly have an argument for Platonism. What I have more is an argument that we all say things in everyday life, whether it's in constructing mathematical proofs. After all, you might just say, I give up on mathematical proofs. But we all say things, I think, that if you, and we engage in reasoning, and if you wanted to represent the reasoning in symbolic logic, there is an x for every x and so on, to get the premises, all the premises you needed for your reasoning to be valid, from those premises there would follow such conclusions as there is an x such that x is a shape. So if I say both everything I say and there are no shapes, I'm going to contradict myself. I don't like contradicting myself. I admit that I don't by myself endorse the Quine-Putnam indispensability argument. I am not in the business of that is, roughly this argument is, well, postulating these things, I forget how the particular version you stated was put, but I don't explain things in philosophy. I leave explanation to police detectives and scientists and people who explain things. I don't explain I don't explain attribute agreement. I don't think the kind of attribute agreement that you think Platonism explains can be explained by anything, Platonism or anything else, and I don't blame nominalists for not having an account of attribute agreement if they don't, because I don't think there could be such a thing. But in particular, I reject the Quine-Putnam indispensability argument, which is an argument that has the conclusion there are abstract objects. I just say, here's why I believe in abstract objects. Every day I say things that imply their existence. And I'm not willing to stop saying those things. I regard them as indispensable. If what I say on logical analysis proves to entail the existence of abstract objects, and I don't like contradicting myself, I'm certainly not going to say there are no abstract objects. And am I not, in some sense, by saying these things that imply the existence of abstract objects, sort of committing myself to their existence? I think so. At any rate, I don't want to say there aren't any.
Yeah. Can I
You want to
follow
come
up?
back? Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yes, please.
Absolutely.
If not identical to the original Quine-Putnam indispensability argument, still, as you acknowledge,
Points of contact, yes.
you work with the Quinean meta-ontological strategies or rules for settling ontological disputes.
Yeah.
So I want to ask this question then. You reject a constituent ontology, which takes properties to be metaphysical constituents of things. As you just said, you also reject any attempt to appeal to exemplification of properties as an explanation of why a particular is as it is, or of why particulars resemble one another. So it occurs to me that it's no wonder you'd rather not be a Platonist, because your properties aren't doing any metaphysical work. They seem to be just idle components of the worldview which you're stuck with because of your commitment to Quine's meta-ontological theses, particularly his criterion of ontological commitment. So in light of that fact, why not reject one or more of those theses and rid yourself of these unwanted freeloaders?
So which should I do? Stop saying all the things I want to say in the ordinary business of life, or contradict myself?
No, I'm suggesting give up some of those Quinean meta-ontological theses,
Like which one?
like that you're ontologically committed to the values of the variables bound by the first order quantifier.
Well, I think that what is there is an X such that X is a dog? It means something is such that it is a dog. It's just an abbreviation for ordinary English in a convenient symbolic form. I don't see any difference between saying there is an X such that X is a dog and something is such that it is a dog. And obviously something is such that it is a dog commits me to dogs if I say that, right?
Well, I mean, does it in ordinary language? I thought there was a prime example in your paper of where you use the first order quantifier in an informal way, I mean, that is not ontologically committing, and that's when you say that there are many things that God cannot do. That would commit you ontologically to the existence of these things, and I don't think you want to say that.
I do with this qualification. That's a perfectly serious qualification. A little bit indeterminate what it's over.
It sounds like it's over predicates.
It might be, for example, over propositions. I might say there are many propositions such that God cannot bring about their truth. Many false propositions such that God cannot bring about their truth. It might say, it might be there are many states of affairs such that God cannot cause them to obtain. So it's just whenever you say there are many things that, that's always sort of a step back. I'm not going to talk about the exact kind of things I'm quantifying over here, but if you pressed me in a philosophical argument, then I would fall back on some particular thing.
Dr. Bridges, did you want to weigh in on this particular thing, or did you have
I would think he would.
An observation or a question? You could take it in another direction if you prefer, and because these guys, I'm sure, could go for quite a while exploring it. There's so much to explore about them, so there's no easy cutoff.
I'm 72 years old. I don't have enough time left on this earth to finish this discussion with Dr. Craig.
No, I appreciate the fact that Dr. Inwagen, some of his metaphysical intuitions start with the things that he expresses about everyday objects. That's good to note. I just think that many of his positions end like a board on a ball. And one of the things is that, and I'm just going to segue into a question
Absolutely.
that I actually
No,
have.
please.
Dr. Inwagen, you say in your excellent essay, A Theory of Properties, when we talk about the pen, we have a pretty good idea of the nature of the thing we're talking about. When we talk about the number 4, we have at best a radically incomplete idea of the nature of the thing we're talking about. We can't really say much about what the things are in the other Platonic part of reality. So, end quote. So, we know more about the nature, this is more of a sort of an epistemological question. We know more about the nature of concrete particulars than we do abstract objects. This is the tragedy of the two-world ontology. But I know the nature of concrete particulars by something like their attributes, their properties, right? But attributes and properties are all abstract objects. And abstract objects are the sorts of things that we don't know very much about. So I'm a little bit at a loss to understand how it is that we know anything about concrete particulars, which everything that I seem to want to say about them end up becoming parts of the other Platonic realm.
Don't see the problem. I know a lot of things about what properties the pen has. I don't know much about what properties have. Properties have properties, right? For example, if there are such things as properties at all. I mean, if we're because things can be predicated properties, and if you think there are properties to start with, then you have all the same reason to think properties have properties to do you think think concrete individuals do. So assuming there is such a property as honesty, let's say it has the property of rarity. Right? There are lots of, but I can't say a lot about the properties of properties the way I can about the properties of the pen. I can write a very long, albeit extremely boring book about the pen. I can take measurements, and I can reverse engineer. I can go have a chapter of reverse engineering, then take it apart to see if I was right. The book can go on and on and on. So, but take the number 4. What's properties? Well, it's got logical properties like everything. For example, not having contradictory properties. It's got arithmetical properties like being an even number, being a positive square root of 2, and so on. Then maybe it's got some metaphysical properties. If you think there is such a thing as the number 4 at all, maybe you think it's necessarily existent, for example, although Frege didn't think so. But then he would have thought it was contingently existent. So we can say something about its metaphysical properties as we can with the pen, but we cannot, unless we have recourse to relational properties. Of course, there's lots of things that form numbers, the cardinal points of the compass, the Stuart Kings of England, the canonical Gospels. Of course, we get a very long list of things that the number 4 numbers. But those are relational properties of the number. If we stick to its intrinsic properties, we can't write a very long book.
Can I ask clarification?
Absolutely.
So, to be clear, things that we can say about the pen, we can give a numerical measure. We can talk about its color. Mm-hmm. Perhaps it's an artificial kind, its penness, mm-hmm. right? But it seems like all those things that I want to say about it, these assertables, right, are themselves attributes or properties. And attributes or properties, how can they be about or in the pen or about the pen?
How can they be true? All right, now here's a question. Let's take a simple assertable, that it's white. That's something you can say about the White House, right? It's something you can say about the Washington Monument. It's something you can say about fresh human blood. Oops, if you say it about fresh human blood, you'll be saying something false. Now, why is it that when you say that it is white of the White House, you're saying something true, and when you say it of fresh human blood, you're saying something false? I do not think that of all, let God survey all the propositions that there are. I don't think among all those propositions that he will survey, he will find one that's an answer to that question. Because I do not think, not every question can have an answer, right? Some questions have, of course you can give trivial answers.
You're finding that out with some of your students this semester, aren't you, on your
trivial
tests?
answers?
Yeah, some of the questions don't have answers.
Why can we say that it is white, truly of the White House? Because it's white. Yeah, right. And that was like saying, Daddy, why is the sky blue? Well, sweetheart, that's because the proposition that the sky is blue is true. Oh, Daddy, how wise you are. It's true, right? That it follows from the proposition that the sky is blue is true, that the sky is blue. But it's not an explanation of why the sky is blue. It follows from the fact that the White House has the property white, that it's white. But it's not an explanation.
Is this ostrich realism?
This would be ostrich, what I called ostrich Platonism, right? That is, David Armstrong accused people who denied that there was a problem of explaining attribute agreement among things of ostrich nominalism. But that is, he used the term nominalist because he assumed it was nominalists that would say this. But I guess I'm an ostrich Platonist, that I don't think the problem exists.
Yeah, and I want to register my agreement with Peter on this score.
Well,
It seems to me that the effort to explain why things are as they are, why they resemble, by appealing to abstract objects, is a pseudo-explanation masquerading as an explanation. If you tell me, or ask, why is the dog brown? I think you would give a scientific explanation in terms of the
Genetics.
absorption and, well, or absorption
genetics,
and reflection
or
of certain light
absorption and
spectra.
There's lots of things. Or you could say, because it causes sensations of brownness in normal human observers under standard conditions. There are lots of answers to the question, what makes this thing brown, or why is it brown? But none of them is this answer in terms of an abstract
Right.
object.
It would not be an explanation to say, because this otherwise colorless dog stands in this mysterious relationship to a colorless abstract object beyond space and time, in virtue of which this dog is brown.
Yeah, I mean, of course, that's not an accurate description of the Platonistic, the
Well, it
Platonistic
stands in
position.
the relation of exemplification to
Yeah,
brownness, right?
Right, but it's not an otherwise colorless dog, and
If it didn't stand in that exemplification relationship, it wouldn't be.
it would stand in that
Well,
example
non-brown
to some
then.
other.
Okay, all right.
Although the color is colorless, it is a color.
But
Even
it
doesn't
isn't
have
itself
any
brown.
colors, but
Right.
No.
All right,
but-
let me see if I can bring this back and tether together more directly issues of abstract objects and God, and ask each of you to just comment. It seems like there's some kind of unavoidable connection, whatever that connection is, whether it's metaphysical or otherwise, between God and numbers, inasmuch as we affirm that there's one God who exists in three persons. So somehow 1 and 3 get in the mix when we try to sustain our orthodoxy as Christians. So I think I would know where you would go with this, but I want you to lead out anyway, and then hear the other two depart from that if they think they need to, in terms of what does that tell us ontologically about numbers and then about God, if it tells us anything.
I would take that a nominalist would say that the triune nature of God no more implies the existence of the number 3 than, say, the existence of a trifurcated object implies the existence of the number 3. That is, if there's a 3-ness in something, you needn't postulate the abstract object, the number 3. And I wouldn't myself say that that was a very strong reason for believing in the number 3. But obviously, if there are numbers at all, then I think they exist necessarily. Maybe you can be a nominalist and say that numbers exist in no possible world. If you're not a nominalist about any possible world, you should be a nominalist or a non-nominalist or a Platonist about all of them. So if there are numbers and God creates numbers, then God is constrained to create. He is not a free he doesn't freely exercise the power of creation. Not a problem for Dr. Craig, because he doesn't think there are numbers in the first place.
Right.
But
That's a problem for the absolute creationists
Yes.
that you're raising, I think.
Go ahead.
Well, I would say that everyone acknowledges that you can use numbers in adjectival ways without commitment to numbers. So I can see there's one God. There are 3 persons in the Trinity. And that isn't ontologically committing to numbers. So that shouldn't be problematic. Perversely, it's when we use numbers in the subject position or nominally, as to say 1 is the number of gods that there is, or the number of persons in the Trinity is 3. By Quine's criterion, you've suddenly committed yourself to numbers, which I think is perverse. Now, one might say, no, that can be paraphrased away by using them adjectively, but nevertheless, when you put numbers in a position in which they are the values of the bound variables, then
Well,
you're
that's- yeah,
supposed to
that's
be
different.
ontologically committed to them.
Well, you're putting them in the position of bound variables is saying that there are such things.
Yes, yes.
Well, naturally, if you say that there are such things, you're committed to them. Putting
Well, I
number
think
in,
not.
putting a number in the, if you say 3 is an even number, according to Quine, that's going to commit you to the existence of the number 3.
Right.
Only if you regard the noun 3 as subject to existential generalization. You don't necessarily do that just because you put it in the subject position.
Could I ask your view on that? Because Quine didn't, as you just said, say that singular terms were ontologically
Right.
committing unless you could say there is something which is appendicitis, for example. What's your view on the ontologically committing nature of the use of singular terms in sentences we take to be true?
I think the true ontological commitment, as Quine said, comes from pronouns.
Pardon me?
Comes from pronouns, that is, variables.
Yeah, uh-huh.
And it all depends. If you say appendicitis as a serious condition, does it follow from that that there are serious conditions? Or does it not? Well, if it does follow, then there are serious conditions is what commits you to serious conditions.
So why don't you become a free logician and adjust the rules for existential generalization so as to avoid unwanted ontological commitments of ordinary language?
What kind of free logic? I mean, you don't just mean a logic that has all its theorems hold in the empty universe, because there are still going to be true, empirically true statements that start with an existential quantifier
Sure.
that I need in premises to get conclusions. So I'm still going to have to use. I mean, suppose if I want to say I want to find out how many cans of paint to use to paint a certain rectangular floor, so I have to use the phrase like the area of a floor in any units is the number that the product of the number that measures the units of one side with the product with the number that measures in those units the adjacent side, and that the product is the number of square units of the floor. There, the numbers all occur in nominal.
Let me
positions.
interrupt here then. I want to hit Dr. Bridges in on this as far as the original question.
Yeah, as much as I'd like to chime in on varieties of free logic. Yeah, so, sorry, go ahead, Richard.
Well, no, I just, what do you
The
think,
one
if
and three of the
anything,
Trinity,
yeah, what
yeah,
does
yeah.
it say about the ontological status, if there is one, when we speak in creedal terms that there's one God and 3 persons? So you've got numbers, you've got God. What can we
Yeah, well,
draw from that?
yeah, so
And by the way, they were, which I didn't say earlier, but I don't know that would have changed what had been discussed. Presumably, if I've understood the creeds correctly, they're eternal. That is, God always was one God, and God always was 3 persons.
right, so there's a difference between God being a Trinity and the number 3 being a mode of enumeration, I would say. So for Aquinas, or at least for Thomists like Jacques Maritain and Armin Maurer, they say that numbers are neither platonically existing entities outside the mind, nor are they free conceptions just created by the mind, but they're beings of reason that are grounded in the discrete particularity of individual existing objects. And then from that, we have numbers become the aggregates of 1 and 1 and 1 is 3. And due to revelation, we see these distinctions between the Father, the Son, the Spirit, all of whom are fully God. And so we say that God has revealed himself as a Trinity. But I don't think the enumeration there commits us to some Platonic notion of numbers.
No, I think that we all agree on that. I mean, Bill.
Well, on that cheery note, why don't I now let us get some questions from the audience. So if you, Doctor, what is the procedure Eric, what do you want them to come to the microphone up here? Will that work? Okay.
Oh, it appeared.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Pretty exciting. So this microphone, for the sake of people in the room to hear you, but more so for the people online.
Do I need to repeat the question?
No.
Oh, good.
So,
Thanks.
you want to kind of man the mic and outrun the
Yeah,
You be the bouncer of the
yeah.
mic.
It looks like it.
So if you would be so kind as to, I realize you have to, some questions need context. So of course you've got to set a context for your question to be understandable, but try not to enter the debate. We have enough fodder to carry on the debate with these three gentlemen. So,
Richard,
any
I
questions?
haven't had a chance to ask JT a question.
Well, why don't you ask them that while they're getting up the courage to come?
We're out of time.
Okay. JT, I was really surprised to hear you describe your position as moderate realism. Because, in my understanding, your position is very different from classical moderate realism as propounded by late medieval thinkers such as Walter Burley, for example, which affirms that universals exist in reality as metaphysical constituents of particulars. Not in a transcendent Platonic realm, but the universals exist in physical objects. Whereas you say the Thomistic position is that abstract objects exist, but only as an object abstracted by the intellect. So white in things is a particular quality. Under the conditions of the intellect, it becomes a universal, even though that is not what it is in the world. The Thomist can affirm with the staunchest nominalist that the only things that exist outside the mind are concrete particulars. And I guess how is this different from anti-realism? How is this different from Occam's conceptualism? Feser, whom you quoted, says that while it holds that universals considered an abstraction from other features exist only in the mind, it also holds that they exist in the extramental things. And you deny that, I believe.
No.
You do not think that universals exist immanently.
Yeah. So the question is, do universals exist in things or not? And kind of yes and no, to be clear. The product of human knowing, maybe I can put it this way, the product of human knowing is based on two distinct powers of knowing, sensation and intellection. Right? So by sensation, we are put into contact with the extramental world, and we are given through sensation individual particulars, white sheets of paper, perhaps. But the Wilhelmsen quote, I think, is telling because he talks about that these two powers of knowing, unified in a single knowing subject, have this aspect of mutual interpenetration. So that the intellect, as it were, so there's no just raw sense data that then the intellect is sort of feasting on. But as the human is moving through the world of extramental, individual particular objects, those objects have qualities, either substantial or accidental, that are common, that are genuinely common as particular metaphysical constituents of those things. And when the intellect recognizes that,
But not numerically identical.
no, absolutely not. No. So this is why in the Brower article, I think he does a service to this confusion where he distinguishes a universal nature, which is something only abstracted, existing in the mind, and a common nature, which is, let's see, how does he say this? It's internally the same, but is derivatively distinct. And what Brower would say is that the difference between an Occam and an Aquinas is that for Aquinas there's a derivative distinctness between the common natures, and for Occam the distinctness would be primitive. At least that's how Brower unpacks the distinction.
All right, questions from the audience. Did anybody have a burning question? Yes, please. And if anybody else has one, you go ahead and make your way up, and we can expedite the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you all for coming here. It was very enriching. My question to all of you is, all three of you come into this question from the standpoint of theists. You believe in God, and that obviously informs and affects how you view the question of abstract objects. If you were to take that away, how would that affect your viewpoint? Would it even be an interesting question anymore if you were not theists? Or if it was still an interesting question, what would your standpoint be on it?
So what is the question?
You took your theism away. Would it
Well,
make
no,
a difference?
what is the question? Which,
If you were-
would it still be an interesting question?
If you were no longer a theist, or would the question of abstract objects still be an interesting question to you? And if it is, what would your position be on it?
Who wants to go first? Dr. Craig, you explicitly connect your
Yeah.
position here with your theology, so if you didn't have
Right.
your theology,
For me, it obviously is very much bound up with my theological commitments, but I must say, I do have a kind of nominalistic or anti-realist bent to me. I have never understood what numbers are supposed to be. For example, when it's said that the number 2 exists. And similarly with many other abstract object sets, I think, are a chimera. Even if I weren't a theist, I don't believe there's such things as sets. It seems to me that we have no reason to take the axioms of standard set theory as serious metaphysical truths. It seems to me these are much more plausibly interpreted as postulates which we are invited to imagine true. And then we can explore the theorems that follow from that. And we're quite free to imagine other axioms or additional axioms to be true, and to explore the theorems that will result from that. And so, even wholly apart from my commitment to theism, I must say that I find myself just very strongly inclined toward an anti-realist view of these abstracta.
you wanted to hear from the other two
Yes,
necessarily? Okay.
Yeah, I would say that I think the question of the nature of abstracta can be resolved before one gets to the level of God's potential interaction with them. Because when Aquinas does this, he does this in the context of his ontology of knowledge, his philosophy of mind, his metaphysics, his epistemology and philosophical anthropology. So if I weren't a theist, but I were still a Thomist, things that are true, he stipulated. Yeah, I think I would still come down to the same position.
You have to remember, JJ, that Thomas also thinks that universals exist not just in my mind, but in God's mind, and they didn't get there by abstraction.
That's right.
And that's very important for when you press him on questions of universals that nobody has ever thought of, or universals that existed before. So I really don't think that you have a complete Thomistic ontology of universals unless you have God in the picture.
Right, yeah, so that would be the difference between an Aristotelian moderate realism and a Thomistic or scholastic moderate realism, which I think has a broader explanatory
I think
scope.
Aristotle thinks that universals exist in the objects independently of the mind.
Yeah, right.
So when you say Aristotelian, you mean, all right, Aristotelian moderate realism doesn't mean moderate realism accepted by Aristotle. It means adapting a sort of Aristotelian version of moderate. Okay. Now, as to me on this question, well, I came to all these positions without much, I think without any theological input at all. I'm a metaphysician, not, say, a philosopher of religion. I was trying to answer questions about what there is in the world to come up with a consistent meta-ontology and ontology. And then but I wrote this, people occasionally raise the question. Dr. Craig isn't the first to raise the question, what is if you think these things are acausal, they must be uncreated. What do you say about that? Look at the Nicene Creed. Look at the opening of the prologue to the fourth gospel. What do you say about that? So I wrote a paper on that, to which he replied. Maybe Gregory of Nyssa got the same result with his uncreated energies. So for me, the theological stuff, well, I mean, it's important to me that I not say anything that contradicts the creeds or the Bible or even the fathers. But it's not, it was not the source of any of the ontology that I have tried to show was consistent with those things.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm representing the online community here. Micah Howard asks a question for Dr. Craig. If there is no abstract objects, then how can I say that 2 + 2 = 4?
There are many different anti-realist positions on mathematical truth. Fictionalists accept the criterion of ontological commitment that Platonists do. And so they would say that since there is no such thing, no object denoted by 2 + 2, and no object denoted by 4, that sentence is in fact false. That might seem jarring until you remember that on this criterion of ontological commitment, to say 2 + 2 = 4 is to say there is some abstract object beyond space and time denoted by 2 + 2, and some object beyond space and time denoted by 4, and that these are the same object. And that is anything but obvious. So it seems to me that the fictionalist position is defensible given the criterion of ontological commitment that he and the Platonists are working with. But I would deny that criterion of ontological commitment. I'm more in sympathy with the neutralist who says that first-order quantification is very lightweight and that we are not necessarily committed to the values of the variables bound by these first-order quantifiers, nor to the singular terms that we use. In fact, I have come to believe that singular terms which denote real-world objects are actually the exception rather than the rule in ordinary English. Most of the singular terms we use do not have any sort of real-world denotation. So I think this criterion of ontological commitment is not at all incumbent upon us, and that allows the neutralist to affirm mathematical truth like 2 + 2 = 4, because he doesn't take that to carry commitments to the reality of objects like 2 and 4. And then there are many other views as well. A figuralist will say these are existential metaphors, and they are true without being literally true. Pretense theorists will say we are to imagine the axioms of piano arithmetic to be true, and then we can derive the arithmetic theorems like 2 + 2 = 4. This is pretense. All of these are, I think, defensible anti-realist points of view.
All right, next question? Yes, sir.
Thank you all for being here tonight. Please excuse me if this is an amateur question. When being asked about the eternality of God and the common question, who created God, I've come to use the analogy, well, God is uncreated and eternal and timeless in the same way that the number 7 is uncreated, eternal, and timeless. Given the anti-realist view, is this analogy invalid?
Is he asking?
It sounds like it's asking you.
Are you asking me?
All of you, preferably.
Okay.
Okay, well, I just spoke, so
Oh,
give someone
okay.
else a turn.
Yes. Yes, on anti-realism, since abstract objects don't exist, and if the number 7 is an abstract object and doesn't exist, it can't be a good analogy for God's eternality.
Thank you.
And it's also completely invalid analogy on the realist position. Mine, anyway. that because you can't explain how there could be a concrete, causally active being who is eternal and necessarily existent on the model of causally, I like your term, causally effete thing. That's the cause. Then nothing could be more different than God and a number. So to explain the necessary existence of one by the analogy of the necessary existence of another, I think is no help at all.
All right. Did you want to add anything?
Well, I would say that I think insofar as the person doesn't understand the idea of existing timelessly or necessarily, that it's a very useful analogy. You would say, just as the Platonist believes that abstract objects have a timeless existence, so I, as a theist, if you do believe this, think that God has a timeless existence. Now, Peter's raised problems for that.
If I was standing there, say, don't
God's causal activity, I think good many philosophers would say God is temporal. Or say his necessary existence. Again, you could say, just as a Platonist thinks that two exist necessarily in every possible world, I think God exists in every possible world. And you're not comparing God to numbers. What you're doing is trying to help the person understand the idea of timelessness or of necessary existence. And in that sense, I think they can be useful to prime the pump.
Dr. Bridges, did you want to say anything? Did you already say something?
I
You already
said that.
something.
You did.
That's
I
all right.
started
I
saying-
lost
yeah,
track
yes.
there, sorry. All right?
Mic to mic.
Okay.
Sounds like a radio show or something. So my question is for Dr. Van Inwagen. If these abstract objects are immaterial and other causally effete and this sort of thing, how is it that we come to know that they exist? Or would you just say, well, it's just by reflection on the sentences that we use and by reflection on what they commit us to? Or is there some other way in which we come to know that these objects exist?
Well, how do we come to know how to calculate the areas of rectangular surfaces? For example, by having measured their sides, how do we come to know? Well, I mean, if you look at the history of people going through that, you will look at the history of people coming into the only kind of relationship to numbers that it's possible for anything to have. You start with the adjectival numbers, but you see that to make general statements, and then you make this transition to the substantive use. You can see this, the difference in the sentence. A jury has numbers, and 12 is an even number, so there can always be a tie vote in a jury. The first use is adjectival, the second use is substantive. We would appreciate this more if we spoke a language with a lot more grammar, like Latin. The three kings in the gospel birth stories, they are tres reges, but because rex is masculine. But the three gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh, they are tria dona, because donum is neuter. So you see that has to be an adjective because it's agreeing trace. It's got the form trace in one place and tria in the other. But when it's a noun, you decline it.
Next question?
Hi.
Hi.
Let me see. Okay, so I think this kind of ties in with the last guy's question, but I'm just having a little trouble understanding what even really is an attribute of something on an axiomatic sense. Is there anything that actually has the property of 4, or any attribute precisely? In the case that there are 4 bananas, but no, there are thousands of atoms that make up those bananas. Those atoms are protons and neutrons and whatnot, and then those are broken down to even smaller string units or something, but even those can't be properly measured at any unit that attempts to measure them could be infinitely broken down into smaller fractional forms of that measurement. If no tangible metaphysical objects or physical objects actually share any particular quality on this extremely base level, what's the reason to assume that these attributes actually exist? Isn't that sort of circular reasoning?
Well, I'm seeing two different issues here. One is, first of all, there is a perfectly precise answer. There is some one positive integer that is the answer to the question, how many people are there now? I don't care how many atoms may be drifting out of my skin, and it may be uncertain whether they're parts of me at a given time. That just means that it's not how many things are parts of persons in this room at the moment doesn't have a definite answer, but how many persons there are in this room, how many human beings there are in this room, whoops, just went down by one. But I said, at any given moment, it has a perfectly precise answer. But what has that got to do with attributes?
Can't you break down every attribute to a numeric value?
An attribute would be something like, well, I mean, there are certainly quantitative attributes like electrical conductivity and ductility and energy content that we can measure in units. I don't know if, say, wisdom. Is anybody wise to degree 0.97? No, I don't think. I don't think so. So some attributes don't have a numerical value, but suppose every new attribute. So maybe something. I think if you could be a human being to a certain degree, maybe when you have a sperm and an egg unite, maybe in the next 12 days or so, you've got something that's a human being only degree 0.5. A lot of controversy about that. But right now, there's a perfectly definite number of people in this room that are human beings to degree 1. There's nobody who falls short of being an absolutely uncontroversial example of the attribute human being in this room.
All right, here's what I want to do next, and I apologize for those of you up against the wall who are poised to ask your question, because we're running short on time. So what I want to do is, in the evening, with each of them, if they so desire, to maybe give just a closing thought that you want us to depart with, a bit of sagacious wisdom, to be redundant.
Yeah, that would be.
It would be redundant.
Yeah.
So I take that back. Can we edit that part out? Where I was
Sure.
Edit the part out where I was redundant. Edit the part out where I was redundant.
You showed a lot of courageous bravery in saying
Yeah,
that.
a lot of courageous bravery going on. So, do any of you have any concluding thoughts before we officially depart? Well, you want to thank your moderator. I know that's all just.
Yeah. I think what I would say is that since I'm part of the school that's hosting, that these types of events they're important. They're important for the Christian community. They're important for our local academic community. I'm just very, very gratified to be able to share the stage with these eminent persons. And I think they model for us people who think deeply and reflectively about important ideas. The truth of them, the rich sort of academic life that a Christian can engage in without leaving his or her Christianity behind. So just this as an example of these types of events valued within the Christian community.
I first learned of the challenge that Platonism poses to classical theism at a Society of Christian Philosophers meeting in Milwaukee when I heard Tom Morris present his paper, Absolute Creation. And it struck me forcefully that this was like a dagger in the heart of theism. I had learned from theologians like Paul Tillich that God is not just one being among many, he's not just another marble in the can, but he is the ground of all being. He's the source of all reality outside of himself. And it seemed to me that if there were these infinitudes of beings independent of God, that this was a serious compromise of classical theism. I put the issue on the back burner for a number of years, not knowing what to do with it, and then about a dozen years ago, I began to study this in earnest. And I was stunned at the panorama that opened up to me of the diversity of views, both realist and anti-realist, on this subject. And I came to see that Platonism, which so many of us have absorbed with our mother's milk, is just one view among a great, great many, and that many of these others, I think, are very defensible and plausible views, so that I am not troubled by this challenge anymore. And I would just say to you that if you are interested in this question, explore the diversity of views that are available, because there truly is a rich cornucopia of diverse perspectives on these defended by philosophers today, both non-theist and theist, and it is a very richly rewarding study.
Dr. Van Inwagen?
To me, I don't know. Here's a parable. So we find the main, let's suppose that Tolstoy wrote War and Peace in a one single big manuscript book, and it's just come to light. And somebody said, oh, we thought Tolstoy was the absolute author of War and Peace, that he wrote down every single thing in this manuscript book himself. Oh, but it turns out that the book was printed with little straight lines to write on, and that there's a number printed up in each corner that the book came with, and that Tolstoy merely wrote the words on those lines and used those numbers to index the pages. I don't think that the lines and the numbers threaten Tolstoy's absolute authorship of War and Peace. They're little bookkeeping devices, right? Similarly, abstract objects are bookkeeping devices. God is the one who fills in the figures in the ledger or writes the novels or whatever you do with a book. But of course, he has to have pages to write on, right? God just looks at everything. Here's one possibility, here's another possibility, and then he looks at one of them and says, let it be. And it is. But he doesn't make the possibilities, rather, he decides which of them is going to be actual. Thank you.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for a stimulating evening, and I trust that if you're capable and got the stamina to hang around a minute or two afterwards, I know some of the people would like to meet you at least, if not get an autograph in a book and such. So let's show them our appreciation with a round of applause. So let's go to God. We've been talking about God in a lot of different ways tonight, so let's go to Him and give Him thanks for all. Father God, we come to you in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. We thank you so much for your love for us, your revelation of yourself to us as your creatures, that you know and pity us because you know that we are but dust, and that you've allowed us to be a part of what you're doing in the world to bring people to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. So we thank you for letting us be a part of that. I pray your blessings on each one here tonight, safety in their travels home, special blessing and watch care over our three interlocutors tonight, Father, as they go back to their homes and their travels. And we just thank you for the ministry that you've given them. As Dr. Bridges said, modeling for us how a Christian can be an intellectual and not compromise our walk with you. And we pray all of these things in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. Good night, everyone.